So I can't tell you how thrilled I am to have you on the show today. I mean, you're one of the people that I admire and I look up to just from all the readings I've done of yours, of the works that you've written. And I'm sure there's quite a large group of people that's in the audience that isn't familiar with you or your work. So I'm happy to have the opportunity to expose them to you and to some of your thoughts because they've so greatly influenced me and my thinking and my work. So just to get started, Dr. Cook-Greuter, can you start out with just telling us a little bit about you and your journey and how you ended up studying and doing what you do?
I always find it funny because at almost 80, there's a long journey. How do you summarize it? I grew up in a early or lower working class family in Switzerland on a path that I think influenced who I am. It was called the philosopher's path. And it was directly on a big river with beautiful big tree, really gigantic trees and swans, and just something you saw every day. And I think it influenced me. It would make me curious about nature. So early on, I became a nature explorer, even as a 10, 12-year-old. And then I went through all the schools. I was lucky. I was, I guess, gifted. And so the path through school was the easiest for me. And it was also a reprieve from my home life. I grew up with a seriously handicapped, mentally handicapped older sister.
Mhm.
So I had to learn to take care of myself because she was the focus of the family. And then because there was no money in the family, I became a teacher, special needs and elementary teacher, and had to teach for 2 years, which I did. And at the meantime, I went to the university and studied several topics, including psychology and foreign languages.
Hmm.
And as part of that in Switzerland, you have to actually go abroad. You can't become an English teacher without having spent a year in an English-speaking country.
Right, right.
But anyway, I spent in Italy, I spent in Los Angeles at Oxy College, and that was all interesting and sometimes traumatic. I was there during the late 60s when there were all the student tumults and all the troubles. And that was a real culture shock. I just couldn't quite imagine. And in 1976, I got a degree from the University of Zurich in linguistics, basically. And then I immigrated to America to marry my husband, whom I met in Switzerland on the opposite side of an exchange program. And we started children. I got into Harvard as a master student, and there I discovered Levinger.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that was a marriage in heaven, because I was both interested in linguistics and I was totally into psychology of development. And her tool, her measurement tool, her assessment relies entirely on the language. And very quickly I discovered her theory did not cover the kinds of responses that I got.
Mm.
And I had a very good intuition. This is meaningful. This is not gibberish what people are writing. It just doesn't fit her idea of how self develops. And eventually I went back to Harvard and got my PhD quite late in 99. So I was already 54, which is, not usual.
Mm.
But that dissertation is still being read. So it made an impact, I think, because it added to the theory on the top and it put a structure underneath that Levinger didn't have.
One of the things that really resonates in what you're talking about is, this focus on human development and that you've had and the philosopher's path and all of that. some of the people in the audience won't even know who you were referring to when you talked about Loevinger, and also will not be thinking in academic terms. So can I ask you to tell us in non-academic terms a little bit about your theory of ego development and what that is? Because when we think of ego, I think most people,
Yes.
layman's term, think of one thing, but I so would love for you to explain that a little bit in more layman's terms rather than an academic's term.
I shall try.
Yeah.
Me, like all words, or in any language, all words are invented, they're constructs, they're not real.
Yeah.
In order to communicate, we need words, or we couldn't.
Yeah.
So the ego is an invented term, something we experience about a self. Another word for it is the self, we experience it. And in the theory, I claim, or I propose, that ego is the fundamental storyteller about life.
Mm.
It always tells a story, no matter what happens. If you ask a person, how did this happen? Who are you? They will tell you a story. And the measurement that we're using to assess people is basically listening to what kind of story does the person tell. And the theory has sort of 9 major stories, from very early, simple stories that few people are like, except some we know who now want to be back as presidents.
Mm.
If you imagine a curve, there's maybe 5 to 10% who are really not even civilized. And then you have 80% of people in the middle 3 stages. And those are the ones that are supported by the society. They get rewarded. If you are one of those executives, most likely you will get rewarded for being at the later of the 3 central stages. And then there is maybe 20% of people who develop further and get even broader views of life. That includes more people, more differences, more capacity, more flexibility. That just grows throughout the stages. It becomes more and more and more. And what's always interesting is people, lots of people, particularly in the integral field, feel that when you reach the later stages, you'll be happier. You won't.
Mhm.
Because it's like either a very simple radio that doesn't pick up too much, still picks up, or one with tons of frequencies. And the more frequencies you have, the more negative and difficult things you also pick up.
On some level, are you talking about consciousness?
On some level, yes. I'm trying to stay away from that word,
Mhm.
actually. But
Yeah.
yes, of course.
Say more about that.
I make a sort of a distinction personally between my personal life and consciousness development and my work. I
Mhm.
don't like to mix them up because some people in our field do mix them up quite awfully. I've always been a skeptic and rather critical in many ways, and that makes me a good researcher, but not necessarily loved.
Yeah. So when you say that, when you say skeptic, right? What are you skeptical about when it comes to human development and then all the theories that we have about ourselves, about humans?
Well, right now, or the last 10 years, I've worked on more indigenous views of reality because the ego development and all the developmental theories are heavily Western flavored.
Mm.
They just are. They make assumptions about human beings that other cultures do not. And it doesn't mean they're not as wise or as capable. And sometimes one would even think maybe a little bit more able to sustain life than we do now, right now, with you know how things are going.
Yes.
With global warming and war on the horizon and all of that. There is something to be learned.
And so what are you learning?
That one can talk. I just wrote this morning in the book about the more than human world. And because we're using animals in the story, we're using she and he and not that, but who. And this is an indication of the reverence for life. It is not anthropomorphizing, which lots of people also do. But it is not that. It's to give the necessary respect to other beings.
Mm. And so what, as you talk and as you say these things, I think there's something that's unspoken here, and I'm trying to decipher it. So,
Okay,
and I don't know what it is, right? So I'm just,
that's right.
I'm feeling it, right? What do you think is our biggest challenge as humans, and what is in terms of our own learning? What is it that we need to learn?
To be more open than we are and not so programmed by the cultures we are living. And that's an incredibly hard thing to do. I always say being an adult is tough. Being a leader is probably even tougher when you're responsible for other people. But to work on becoming more aware of your own thoughts, your own ways you make sense of things, and notice your own defenses. We feel it, we get an anger thing, or we get irritated. I say that's like a little dog next to you that barks at everything that comes along, whether it's important or not. You have to train that doggy and say, sit still. To only bark when there's real danger. That's a big learning, just to notice when we have strong feelings of one kind or another, and then watch, pay attention, not immediately act or defend or accuse or all the things we do.
Yeah.
That would, I think, would make a big difference.
That's a great analogy with the dog. I love that. What would you say, from the work you've done, all the studying you've done on ego and development, on people, on development, what do you think is innate, and what do you think is basically programmed?
Well, we all get programmed. We all, get programmed by our families, by our immediate environment. Then we go through school. This is all, it's a strong word. Socializing is a
Right.
nice word.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there are differences in people. So, the happenstance of birth, your intellect. Well, I grew up with this Down syndrome sister. So it was a huge contrast that was it still to this day is visceral to me. She was gifted in some ways, but of course, mentally, she couldn't do very much. She couldn't dress herself, and so looking at even at somebody's staff, looking with a, a kind of eye that says, this person is a unique person. It's not just a stage, even if we have the measurement, they're way more. They're made up of so many influences, both physical differences, uh, differences in attitude, differences in how you defend yourself, many, many, many differences, artistic talents or not, so that we can look at somebody in each case, no matter who you have in front of you, and sort of say, what is it like to look through your eyes at the world? What is it like to step in your shoes? And that's basically what testing tries to do, is to get a sense of how a person makes sense of them. This is unique. Each one is different. So that's still fascinates me.
How do we learn, and from your opinion, and this is your opinion,
Yes.
to get better at that, at being more open, to become more apt to look at things not as a story, but really be present there with someone?
Now you make me laugh because, of course, I have to say become more conscious.
There we go with that word again, right?
Yes.
Right.
Unavoidable, aware, more
Yeah.
in tune with what's happening, rather than sort of running on automatic, which is lots of what we have to do, particularly at work sometimes. You have to get things done, and then it's easy to get into the trap of automatic behavior and routine. And But what's interesting about that is most people, when they're in that trap, they actually notice and they're not happy. It's not satisfying. And so to look at what would be important in terms of what does each person think is the good life.
Yeah. Now, I'm with you on what you're saying, and I'm going to ask you this question because I'm assuming people are thinking this. Is like, okay, what you both are saying is really, really profound. And as you look at people, at, for example, I'm leading an organization. I can't satisfy everybody. I can't look at everybody. I've got to look at the collective. So how do I navigate that? Right? And also hear and listen and see people.
There's, of course, different ways. In a one-on-one situation, you can always have that inner question. What is it like to be you? How do you make sense of things? Of course, if you have an organization, you also have to embed structures in it. And newer theories actually are about organizational development and deliberately developmental organization. There are books about that by, now I forget the name.
Right, but yeah, it's a whole field.
There's a whole field out there. And if you experience a company like that, I've worked with one now for 10 years, there is a huge difference because the quality of others' lives and their learning is embedded into the structure. Being community oriented is rewarded rather than saying that takes away from our bottom line.
You know, you mentioned earlier the stages, and I want to capture this thing that you said. Now you're interested in indigenous thinking, and how did that evolve for you, and how has that expanded your view of ego development?
Partially through interactions when I was traveling. I was lucky because I'm an independent scholar. I'm not beholden to anybody or any institution, and people invited me to lecture and give trainings about this topic across the world. And I spent, particularly in Australia, I got to get deeper into how Aboriginal being is. It's not even thinking, it's the wrong word, but how they approach nature, how they live with it and have for thousands of years. That made a huge impression on me, to think we were so limited.
I'm listening carefully to what you just said. I'm wondering, as you talk, and you talk about, basically what I'm hearing you say is that we live in a global world. And you know, we're narrow just even in that aspect, right? That we're looking at things from whatever, not only from our lens, but also from the country that we're socialized in, or from the product,
Capitalistic,
right?
all the
Or
value,
the
the
economic system
economic
parts.
theories that
Yeah.
pull down stuff, all of that are
That,
they explain a lot, but they don't explain human beings.
right. And so we're still at square one, is what I'm hearing. And so do you think, and this is just my question to you that's coming up, do you think we have done ourselves a disservice with too much of relying on science?
On a particular type of science, perhaps, yes.
Yeah.
And of course, it explains a lot, but then there's a human nature. Our drive to explore, to exploit, to go to other planets and be the first to, put your flag in so you then can exploit the natural resources.
Right.
This is part of has been happening as long as we know, since time immemorial. It's part of that thing that's actually in the long run a danger, because we're smarter in some ways than any other creature. Only from this perspective, we have been able to conquer things and
Yeah.
subdue them. And I don't know whether I should say that, but of course I find some of the religious beliefs and ways of looking at all of this also dangerous.
Yeah.
When
Yeah.
God says, go out there and subdue and dominate.
How do we change? How do we evolve into a species that is more aware? Because you're talking about awareness.
I'm not sure. As I said, I'm a skeptic, and I'm actually considering not just the demise of a particular species or individual death, which we all have to face, but
Mm.
the species the demise, that we don't survive, that we actually have done so much damage, and it's so late in the whole thing that short of a kind of miracle.
Yeah,
Not sure. I truly am not sure. And I hope, and I've talked to younger people who do have a positive, a more positive attitude. And they're, I'm old, so all the technologies, all that AI stuff in some ways frightens me.
I think you're right. And a couple things I would say that just come up for me, and it's not a judgment, it's just a thought, is, it's interesting you characterize yourself as old. And I'm not seeing that as we talk, and I don't know what that is. Again, that's another word we're using, right? In terms of to
It
differentiate
is.
age, right?
You can
Uh,
have a young spirit, but an old body. I would say that's true for me. So
Yeah. But I'm really appreciative of the wisdom that you're bringing forward today, because I know that that perspective comes from a lot of information and knowledge and study over the years. So it's an informed perspective when you talk about the humanity. I've talked to a couple other people too that are in the field, and they give similar pessimism. And I don't mean it pessimism as a label, but that, we've got to make some changes, because the path we're going down is not a good one. And that's what I'm hearing from you. I'm hearing it from some other thought leaders. I'm feeling that way myself, just in terms of not optimistic, but wow, we really have to rise up on some level. So say what
the
you were about to say.
distinctions I'm making is between being realistic, which I think I am, and maybe and you and many others as well,
Yeah.
and idealistic, believing in something getting better when there is very little evidence for it.
Yeah.
And yet again, it's human nature to hope.
Right.
How would we be without some hope, some imagination that things can get better, even when all the evidence doesn't look particularly promising?
Yeah.
So young people are where I put my face.
Yeah, exactly. So what do you think needs to happen into the human species in order for it to change or to evolve differently?
To be open enough to even consider things like AI
Mhm.
and what it can do, and how it, cyborgs, or having young people I talked to, millennials, told me they imagine, they were smart, but they said they imagine they can download a language into their heads.
Mm.
I mean, just for me, that is unimaginable. And yet there is indications that
Yeah,
that's the way
that's
we're
very
going.
possible.
So,
Yeah.
so what do I know? I'm maybe I shouldn't say that, but in some ways I'm glad I won't be here in, 10 years or whatever, because I don't think I could stomach it
Hmm.
or understand it enough to feel. I see mostly the downsides of it.
Yeah, and it's interesting at the very beginning, when we were talking, you said, as you get into different stages, you don't become happier. It actually, you see more.
You see more, but you're more able to deal with it.
Right.
And the fundamental, I'm actually a happy person despite all of the, because this daily, minute by minute, there are joyful things.
Right.
There's joyful background, joyful big blooms. Uh, just I look out and see trees. I smell. It just It's small. It's not big, but it's tiny, and it's uplifting, and it keeps me happy. Serene maybe is a better word.
I like that word. How do you think people can start to bring more of that into their lives, and whatever stage they're in, or whatever
Yes.
situation they're in, more of that, what you just talked about, serene? serenity, and also joy.
And paying attention to what is actually beautiful. And it has been forever. You know, if you see a bloom open, or if you look at the smile in a child, even somebody else's child, just playing effortlessly, just giving in to play, that can create joy. So pay attention to the little things, is what I would say. Even one a day is better than just routine, just the way it always was. What's new? What surprises you?
Yeah.
That question, we're walking around with that question. What's beautiful? What surprised me?
Yeah, and you see even your facial expressions, right? When you start talking about beauty and awe, because that's what I'm hearing is like
Yes,
what's up?
wonder and awe. Yeah.
Yeah, is that your whole being changes. And maybe that's part of the, I don't know if there's an answer, but maybe that's part of the formula.
And what I like about is because you can teach even children, you can teach that to any person at any level, just to help them notice what's beautiful, what's interesting, what's different. And with that kind of attitude, no, different, no, 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 don't come to me, but oh, interesting, it's different. I wonder what it means. I wonder what it is like for that creature to eat whatever herb they're eating in my garden that I would rather eat myself.
Well, and as you say that, Dr. Cook-Greuter, what is kind of encompassing this whole conversation is if we could see people that way
Yes,
and see each other that way, right?
yes,
It's with
support each
wonder and awe,
other.
that openness you talked about, being able to
Yes.
be open to see people. What is your experience? What are you experiencing? I mean, that in itself might be an antidote to what's
And
happening.
an antidote and a lever to growth.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Fascinating conversation. I'm walking away with so much to think about as you talk. But so I'm going to ask you for the last question. What advice would you give? You know, the one of the things we talk about is everything that we just talked about is really leading a little bit with more soul.
Yes.
However we want to define what soul is, it's more essence, right? That's what how
Well,
I define it.
the warmth that
The
comes with the
internal
attitude.
essence of a
Yeah,
human.
yeah.
How can people, and I think you've mentioned this throughout, but just to solidify this at the end, how do you think people can lead and live with more soul with each other?
By making a conscious decision
There we go. Yeah.
uh, to pay more attention to that aspect of life, rather than all the things we have to do, and the ordinary, but to look for the extraordinary, the simple, delicate extraordinary, but to find it in nature and in other people
Yeah.
and in situations and in organizations. There's almost always something you can find that is precious, but you have to look.
Yeah. And you have to be in a place of not being worried about fear. I mean, the fear piece, right? The fear. There's a
Yeah,
piece
we
of that.
all, yeah, that it's hard because it's good reason to have fear
Right.
in many cases. That absolutely realistically true. The difference is between fear that is imagined and real danger. And even to learn that, because our bodies react to danger regardless,
Right.
whether it's imagined or real, to
Right.
learn to distinguish when which is the case.
Right. And that goes back to what you said at the very beginning, which you talked about putting the defenses down. And I
Yes,
think that's part of this
that's
whole conversation.
definitely part of that, to be able to do that. And I understand if people in many life circumstances can't, they actually have to be on guard. and they do not have the extra energy to go look and enjoy, except very few unusual individuals who you'll find anywhere. But most people really are suffering from the daily grind, and they don't know how to get out of it. And that makes me sad, because I wished one could lift everybody.
Yeah. I so appreciate this conversation with you. I feel full, but I just want to ask you before we end, you're working on a new book.
Yes,
So if in a real brief nutshell, can you tell us a little bit about what it's about?
it's about ego development, but clad in a fable. I live near Walden Pond here in Massachusetts. It's clad that an otter from Australia, my co-author in some ways, is coming to just visiting, and then the very old owl invites him to stay because she wants him to introduce him to the different animals around the pond. So they have all these encounters, lovely ones, horrible ones, depending on the stage, and then she explains to Otter what's good about it, or why the fox is the earliest, why he behaves the way he does. So there is no blame. There is not, oh, look what a stupid, unevolved being. It's just from his experience and from his character. He is not very clever, and he attacks. And so the whole thing is a study in ego development, but phrased and in such a way that even, but for what's the word? Now I can say it, lay people, not for, it's totally.
Not an academic, discourse, right? So that people that don't
Yeah,
understand
and
a
I
lot of
actually
the theory,
enjoy
right?
not writing academically.
Yeah,
And
no, and as you described that, I think that is useful for everybody that's listening right now, because as you were just describing that, I was thinking, wow, that's our life, right? When we're in situations or organizations, or just like the
all of
pond,
these
where we
critters,
don't, there are all these different people, and yet we get ruffled by them. And the owl doesn't get ruffled. The owl is wise, right? So the owl is working with all of these different types of people and
yes,
learning how to navigate the fact that, hey, we're not all in the same place.
and fundamentally there is the dignity of all.
Right. Right. And
So at the end they have a party where everybody comes together to say goodbye to this otter, and communal agreements they make about what it means to live with us at Walden. These are the rules.
okay, so I'm sorry, but here's what I'm going to say as we close this podcast. I asked you earlier, I said, is there hope for us, right? And you were like, I don't know. But perhaps what you're offering us in this Walden book is where the hope is where we
There
learn.
is, my hope is embedded
Yes.
in that. Yes, you very well observed. Yes.
Is
Yeah.
if we learn to actually appreciate the fox and the
Yes.
otter and all the other animals that may or may not be in the same frame as I am.
Yes.
Yeah, and we all work together on the pond. I love it. I mean, I think that is a story of hope.
Okay. Wonderfully
I don't know if
phrased.
that's what you intend, but I'm taking it that way
No,
in my
it
meaning
comes from
making.
that place in me, I would say, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the joy as well. I mean, just the critters just delight me.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, my wise woman today. I really appreciate your time and I appreciate your wisdom.
Thank you for having me and making me think.